when discipline no longer asks permission. There is a kind of discipline that makes people uneasy to stand next to. Not loud. Not impressive. Just unmoving. You see it in the way someone shows up without checking the room. Shoes placed by the door the night before. Hands tying laces with stiff fingers. Cold air filling the lungs. No glance at the phone. No pause to feel ready. The body moves first, and that movement creates distance. Most people believe discipline begins with motivation. That you feel something, then act. That belief is why their routines fracture quietly. They start fast. They miss a morning. They negotiate the next one. Soon the habit becomes a discussion, and discussions are where things die. Watch how it actually collapses. An alarm rings. Heavy eyelids resist. Shoulders tense. The room is dim. The mind offers reasons. Just today. Just this once. The body stays still, and that stillness spreads. Later, coworkers laugh about being human. Friends nod in agreement. The failure feels shared, and that makes it comfortable. But there is another pattern. Older. Colder. In temples and training halls, no one waits to feel aligned. Knees fold onto the mat because that is where knees go. The floor is cold. Breath is shallow. Muscles ache from yesterday. Still, the sequence begins. Not from strength. From familiarity. Skipping would feel wrong in the body, and that wrongness carries a social weight. Others notice when you break form. This is discipline without motivation. Not heroic. Not emotional. Just assumed. If that unsettles you, it should. Before you continue, write the habit you've been negotiating with for months. No explanation. Just the action, the person who always starts again. Let me tell you about someone familiar. He wakes early the first week. The room is quiet. The air is cool against the skin. Shoes wait by the door. His pulse quickens with the idea of becoming different. At work, he mentions the plan. People smile. Someone says it's good to see him focused again. The approval lands warm, and he carries it into the morning. By the second week, the alarm sounds the same, but the body answers differently. Legs feel dull. The mouth is dry. Shoulders ache from sitting too long the day before. He sits on the edge of the bed and listens to the clock. The plan still exists, but now it requires persuasion. He checks a message. The room brightens. The moment thins. Later, he jokes about needing coffee first. Others laugh. No one expects more. He is not weak. He reads the right books. He knows the methods. On good days, he moves with precision. On bad days, he waits for alignment. Waiting becomes a habit. The body learns to pause until the mind grants permission, and permission grows expensive. Each delay feels small. Each restart feels noble. Together, they carve a pattern that looks like effort and behaves like retreat. Watch the mechanics. The night before, he does not set the clothes out. The floor remains empty. In the morning, fingers fumble through drawers. The light is harsh. Time compresses. He decides to shorten the session. Then to move it later. The decision-making drains him before movement begins. By noon, the plan survives only as a story he tells himself, and stories are easy to keep. There is social friction here, but it is gentle. Friends praise intention. Coworkers admire ambition. No one notices the missed repetitions. In fact, they relax when he falters. It reassures them. Predictability returns to the group. When he skips, the room stays warm. When he returns, they clap softly, as if greeting a guest. Contrast that with someone who does not restart. Not because they never fail, but because failure does not change the sequence. Their alarm rings. The body rises. The floor is cold. The breath is shallow. They step into motion without ceremony. If injured, The pace slows. If sick, the session shortens. The chain remains unbroken. Others stop asking how they feel. They begin to assume. The difference is not effort. It is the absence of choice. One person negotiates every morning and pays for it all day. The other pays once, long ago, by deciding who they are allowed to be. That decision has a weight. It presses on the room. It creates silence when excuses appear. And silence exposes the next weakness, where choice quietly corrupts the morning. The collapse does not happen loudly. It happens in the narrow space between waking and standing. The alarm stops. The room holds its breath. Cold air presses against the chest. Fingers curl, then loosen. The body waits for instruction it should never receive. This is where most mornings are lost. Not to exhaustion, but to dialogue. He lies still, eyes half open, and begins the inventory. How late it is. How sore the legs feel. What the day demands. The mind frames each detail as evidence. Each thought carries the tone of reason. Each reason feels harmless. Together, they form a negotiation the body was never meant to win. In training halls, there is no such pause. When the bell sounds, feet touch the floor. The mat is rough. Knees bend. Breath stutters, then steadies. No one asks if today deserves effort. The sequence absorbs the question before it forms. Watching from the side, it looks rigid. Inside, it feels simple. Modern mornings are crowded by comparison. A man rises late, then scrolls. Light from the screen burns behind the eyes. Shoulders slump forward. The spine curves to accommodate comfort. By the time he stands, the posture of the day is set. At work, he explains himself. People nod. Someone says balance matters. The explanation travels with him, legitimized. Another man rises and moves without checking the world first. Shoes are already placed. The floor is cold, and he steps anyway. Breath fogs briefly. The street is empty. When he returns, there is no story to tell. At work, he is quiet. When asked how he does it, he shrugs. The shrug unsettles people more than an answer would. Choice corrodes discipline because it invites mood to sit at the table. Mood arrives with demands. It wants music. It wants ideal conditions. It wants recognition. When those are absent, it withdraws support. The body learns this pattern quickly. It learns to wait. Remove the choice, and the body adapts differently. Hands wrap the handle the same way every time. Knees fold without ceremony. Breath counts return when resistance appears. The belt is tied before the mind begins bargaining. Each repetition dulls the need for permission. The action becomes expected, like breathing after submersion. There is a social cost to this. Friends notice you are harder to move. Invitations come with disclaimers. I know you probably won't. Jokes sharpen. They call it obsession. Rigidity. You feel the distance when plans shift and you don't. The room adjusts around you instead of the other way around. That adjustment is not comfort. It is pressure. Pressure reveals who still believes discipline is a feeling. The moment you stop explaining yourself, others must confront their own explanations. Some step back. Some grow quiet. A few watch closely, uneasy with what might be required of them next. And that unease does not fade. It waits for the next morning, when the alarm rings again, the quiet war no one sees you lose. The conflict is small enough to hide. It fits inside the chest. It tightens the jaw. It settles behind the eyes before anyone else is awake. No one hears it, which is why it keeps winning. He stands in the kitchen, hands on the counter. The surface is cold. The light hums overhead. A dull ache rests in the lower back. He tells himself he will train later. The words feel reasonable. The body relaxes at the promise. That relaxation is the signal. The war has already tilted. This battle is not about strength. It is about timing. The mind speaks first, and the body follows orders it should never receive. Once the dialogue begins, the outcome is decided. Every argument sounds intelligent when spoken alone. In older places, the order is reversed. The body moves before the mind wakes fully. Feet find the floor. The mat scratches the knees. Breath catches, then finds rhythm. Thought arrives late and finds no leverage. There is nothing left to debate. Watching this, outsiders mistake it for control. Inside, it feels like relief. Modern life trains the opposite reflex. Notifications arrive before breath settles. Messages demand replies. Schedules shift. Each interruption teaches the body to wait for instruction. Over time, stillness becomes the default. Movement requires justification. At work, this looks like professionalism. In the morning, it looks like delay. Socially, negotiation is rewarded. People praise flexibility. They admire those who adapt. When you say you'll see how you feel, heads nod. It sounds mature. When you say you train at the same hour regardless, the room stiffens. Someone asks if you ever rest. Another jokes about burnout. Their concern carries a warning: don't make us look undisciplined. By contrast, the internal war sharpens here. You feel the pull to soften your edges, to explain, to reassure. Silence would be simpler, but silence has consequences. When you stop narrating your choices, others must narrate their own. That discomfort has a weight. You feel it when conversations shorten, when invitations arrive later, when your predictability unsettles plans. Inside, the body is learning a different lesson. When resistance appears, intensity drops, not consistency. When exhaustion surfaces, pace slows, not direction. When the schedule breaks, the next available slot is taken without emotion. These responses are not heroic. They are pre-decided. The body executes them like reflex. The mind still speaks. It never stops. But its voice loses authority. It becomes background noise, like traffic outside the dojo walls. The real decision was made long ago, when the sequence was fixed. Each morning now tests only one thing: whether you will reopen a war you already ended. And most people do. Quietly. Again, the day the system replaced willpower. The shift is subtle. It does not feel like improvement. It feels like removal. He stops deciding. Not dramatically. Just quietly. The night before, clothes are laid out. Shoes face the door. The belt rests folded. Hands place them there without ceremony. The room is dim. The body is already tired. That is the point. Decision is extracted while the mind is weak. Morning arrives. The alarm cuts through sleep. Heavy eyelids lift. The floor is cold. Feet find it anyway. There is no scan of the body. No check of mood. The sequence has begun, and sequences do not ask how you feel. Breath is shallow. Shoulders are tight. The body moves inside the constraint it was given. This is where willpower used to sit. This is where people fail. But willpower has been replaced by structure, and structure does not negotiate. In training halls, the same principle governs everything. Fixed time. Fixed action. No variation unless injury demands it. When rain falls, practice moves indoors without thought. When exhaustion appears, intensity drops, not consistency. When the schedule breaks, the next available slot is taken immediately. The system absorbs disruption the way a wall absorbs wind. Modern systems do the opposite. They invite choice at every step. What time feels right? What music fits the mood? Whether today counts. Each option seems harmless. Together, they hollow the act. By the time movement begins, the body is already compromised by indecision. Socially, systems are uncomfortable. People ask why you are so rigid. They test the edges. Just this once. You deserve a break. Their words carry familiarity. They are offering you back to the group. Acceptance waits on the other side of flexibility. You feel this pressure when you decline without explanation. The silence lands hard. Someone fills it with a joke. Another changes the subject. The system you follow is invisible, but its effects are not. It makes you predictable. Predictability removes leverage from others. That is why it irritates them. Inside the system, something else happens. The body begins to trust the sequence. Hands wrap the handle the same way every time. Knees fold onto the mat without pause. Breath counts return when resistance appears. The belt is tied before the mind starts bargaining. Repetition dulls drama. Drama starves without attention. This does not make you intense. It makes you calm. Calm is threatening. Calm suggests the problem was never motivation. It suggests the problem was access to choice. Once the system is in place, failure changes shape. Missing a session feels physical, like stepping out of rhythm. The body notices the absence before the mind justifies it. That sensation is not guilt. It is dissonance. And dissonance demands correction. People sense this and step carefully. Invitations become specific. Expectations adjust. You are no longer someone who tries. You are someone who arrives. The system has done what willpower never could. And it will be tested next, when conditions are worst. Continuity holds when perfection breaks. The test arrives quietly. Not as failure, but as inconvenience. The body wakes heavy. Heat lingers behind the eyes. Fingers feel thick. The floor is still cold. Yesterday's work sits in the legs like wet sand. This is where perfection would demand absence. This is where continuity steps in instead. He shortens the session without discussion. Movements slow. Breath stays shallow. The body obeys a smaller order, not a different one. Knees touch the mat. Hands move through the same sequence. The chain remains intact. No one applauds this adjustment. That is its strength. Most people wait for ideal conditions. When those disappear, they stop entirely. They tell themselves it is sensible. Friends agree. Listen to your body, they say, meaning stop when it becomes inconvenient. The body listens and learns a dangerous lesson: consistency is optional. In older practices, continuity outranks intensity. A monk with fever still sits, briefly. A warrior with injury practices footwork slowly. A writer writes one sentence on bad days. These acts look insignificant from the outside. Inside, they prevent the break. The break is what matters. You feel the difference in the body. After a shortened session, there is no guilt. No relief either. Just alignment. The pulse steadies. The dull ache remains, but it is familiar. Familiar pain is manageable. Absence is not. Socially, this confuses people. They expect drama around setbacks. They ask if you should be resting more. You answer without explanation. The lack of narrative unsettles them. They are used to stories of comeback and collapse. Continuity offers neither. It offers repetition. Repetition without spectacle changes perception. Others stop tracking your highs and lows. They stop asking how it's going. Your effort becomes background noise. That invisibility is a cost. It is also protection. No one pressures what they no longer monitor. Inside, the body recalibrates expectation. It no longer asks for perfect conditions to move. It asks only for the signal. When the signal arrives, it responds. When the signal weakens, it responds less. When the signal disappears, it notices immediately. That noticing carries weight. Perfection flatters the ego. Continuity reshapes identity. One demands applause. The other demands presence. Over time, the body prefers the second. It feels safer, predictable, like returning to a path already worn. This is why gaps are dangerous. Not because of lost progress, but because they teach the body to tolerate absence. Once absence is tolerated, it expands. Continuity resists that expansion quietly, without claiming virtue. And quiet resistance will be required soon, when obstacles appear without warning. When obstacles arrive, thinking arrives too late. The disruption never announces itself. It slips in sideways. Rain on the pavement. A meeting moved earlier. A train stalled. The body registers the change first. Breath tightens. Jaw sets. The old reflex reaches for explanation. This is where most people pause. This is where thinking begins to spend time it does not have. He feels it in the shoulders as he checks the clock. The window hums with rain. Shoes are still by the door. The system does not ask for interpretation. It asks for translation. When rain falls, training moves indoors. When the schedule compresses, the session contracts. The sequence bends without breaking. This is not adaptability born of creativity. It is adaptability born of decision already made. Most people treat obstacles as questions. Can I still train? Is it worth it now? Should I move it later? Each question opens a branch. Each branch demands evaluation. By the time an answer forms, momentum has cooled. The body settles back into stillness, relieved. In disciplined systems, obstacles are conditions, not debates. When X happens, Y follows. No pause. No self-talk. The rule lives outside mood. That externality is crucial. It removes ego from the moment. The body executes like a tool returning to use. Socially, this looks inflexible. Colleagues frown when you leave early to keep a window. Friends sigh when you won't reschedule for convenience. Someone says you're difficult. Another says you're intense. Their reactions carry a request: reconsider. Make room for us. You feel that request as pressure in the chest. A tightening. The urge to smooth things over. To explain the logic. You don't. You adjust your bag. You step into the rain. Water hits the face cold. Breath shortens, then steadies. The decision was already made yesterday. Over time, obstacles lose their power to surprise. The body expects friction. It learns responses the way it learns balance. When the floor is slick, steps shorten. When time is thin, movements sharpen. When energy dips, range narrows. The action continues. Others notice the lack of drama. They stop testing your boundaries. Or they test them harder, hoping to find elasticity. When they don't, something shifts. Some respect it. Some resent it. Either way, the negotiation ends. Inside, thinking changes role. It moves from commander to witness. It still narrates. It still doubts. But it no longer issues orders. Orders were finalized long ago, encoded into sequences that activate under pressure. This is why pre-decided responses matter. Not because life is predictable, but because it is not. When disruption strikes, the mind arrives late. The body must already be moving. And soon, that movement will no longer feel like effort at all, when the body moves before permission exists. At some point, the effort disappears. Not suddenly. Quietly. He notices it one morning without satisfaction. The alarm rings. The body rises. Feet meet the floor. Cold seeps into the skin. Breath pulls shallow, then settles. There is no surge of resolve. No internal command. Movement happens the way swallowing happens. Automatic. Necessary. This is the moment most people never reach, because they stop too early. They mistake discipline for force. They expect strain to be permanent. When strain fades, they think something is missing. In reality, Something has been replaced. The body has learned the order. Hands wrap the handle the same way every time. Knees fold onto the mat without thought. The belt tightens. The sequence unfolds. The mind watches from a distance, offering commentary that goes unanswered. Its voice has not vanished. It has lost jurisdiction. Socially, this is when friction sharpens. People begin to describe you differently. Not as motivated. As rigid. Predictable. Someone says you're hard to read now. Another says you've changed. Their tone carries uncertainty. They are used to people who fluctuate. Your steadiness breaks their internal math. You feel it in rooms. Conversations pause when you enter late from training. Plans are made without expecting your flexibility. Someone jokes about setting their watch by you. Laughter follows, Finn. The joke contains a truth they don't know how to hold. Inside, there is no pride. Pride would imply effort. There is only alignment. When you miss a session, the body reacts immediately. A tightness in the chest. A sense of being off step. Not guilt. Not shame. Disruption. The sequence wants completion. This is discipline as identity. Not something you do daily. Something you violate when you don't. The inversion is complete. Training is no longer the exception that requires motivation. Skipping is the exception that demands explanation. You see the change in how time feels. Mornings compress around action instead of thought. Evenings prepare without ceremony. There is less to manage. Less to decide. The mental space once occupied by negotiation empties out, leaving quiet. That quiet unsettles others more than intensity ever did. Intensity can be argued with. Quiet cannot. Quiet suggests permanence. This is where discipline becomes visible without being advertised. It shows up in posture. In timing. In the absence of excuses. It does not announce itself. It simply continues. And continuation, once embodied, does not ask if you are ready. It moves, when discipline is no longer a decision. At the end of this path, discipline stops feeling like effort entirely. Not because it became easy. Because it became true. What you call discipline was never meant to be summoned daily. It was meant to replace something far more fragile, choice. The strongest person in the room is rarely the one pushing hardest. It is the one who no longer asks whether today counts. Their body already knows the answer. This is the inversion most people never make. They wait for energy, clarity, or alignment. You removed the wait. You built a life where action happens before opinion. Where routine carries weight. Where skipping feels unnatural, not heroic. That change is not internal only. It alters how others treat you. Conversations shift. Expectations harden. People stop asking if you're in the mood. Some admire it quietly. Others pull away. Both reactions are confirmation. Discipline as identity always creates distance. There is no finish line here. No moment where you announce arrival. The proof shows up instead in absence, the absence of excuses, of negotiation, of self-convincing rituals. What remains is repetition. Calm. Predictable movement through resistance. This is not about becoming extreme. It is about becoming reliable. To yourself first. To the sequence you decided would govern you when motivation disappeared. If something in this unsettled you, pay attention to that. Discomfort is often the first honest signal. Comment your public commitment below. One sentence. No explanation. Just the action you will perform, at the same time, regardless of how you feel. Subscribe if you recognize this path. Not because it inspired you, but because it exposed you.